Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, today is kind of a special show, man. How are you today?
Not too bad, not too bad. I hadn't been on in a while, so I almost feel like a guest at this point. But it's good to be back, and certainly a milestone. Show 300.
Yeah, it's we're about, I don't know, a little over 6 years in, 300 shows. So if nothing else, it says we've been relatively consistent. We've been trying to crank out one show basically every week. So proud of that. So, real quick before we jump into all this, we've been doing, we're at around 300 shows. We've had a little over 3 million listens. We've had about 30 companies that have come on the show and gotten acquired. And so big thank you to not only everybody who's ever been a guest on the show, but huge thank you to everybody who listens to the show. Week in and week out, the numbers have grown, the audience has grown, which has been really, really awesome. Thank you for telling a friend. Thank you for recommending us to other people and so forth. I think, from time to time, people will say, hey, what new shows do you guys, do people listen to? And we see our name pop up. So big thank you to everybody who listens to the show. And Aaron, I'm still to this day surprised that anybody gives us 30 minutes a week.
I'm shocked.
Do you remember like our first pitch to the first couple of guests that we made? Do you remember what that was?
It was basically along the lines of, yeah, we don't have a clue. Can you help us? And people did.
Yeah, I remember it being something along the lines of like, hey, we're two nobodies. We'd like to learn about whatever you're smart about, and we'll record it and put it on the internet. To this day, I think our pitch is still basically the same thing. It's just now it's like, hey, a bunch of people listen, but it's still like, hey, would you like to come tell us what you're smart about, and we'll record it and put it on the internet. So it's I feel like we're a little bit like Craigslist. Like we really haven't changed our format in a long time, and I'm glad people like it. We've tried to listen to feedback, but it's been an interesting ride. So
yeah, absolutely.
So we were we had a lot of big plans for what was going to be show 300. I think the big thing we were going to do was we were going to try and get some folks from our family to come and tell us what they think we do or why we do this at night or whenever we record it. We didn't get a chance to get around to that. We will get some of those out because they're a little bit funny. But why don't we get started? I think we thought what we would try and do this week with this show is be a little introspective and retrospective, look back at the last 6 years in terms of trends and stuff, and kind of figure out where we thought we were going to be and where we are and what worked and didn't work and all that sort of stuff. So you want to kind of jump into it? What, I guess, looking back, what's surprised you the most, or what's maybe not surprised you the most over where not so much the show, but like where the industry's been over the last 5 or 6 years?
It's one of those, not the rise of it was the surprise, just the level of the rise. And that's simply AWS and public cloud as a whole. Way back when we got this going was, AWS was really just hitting their stride. And I think the first reInvent was that year, and no one knew exactly how big they were, but it felt like something. And now they're just this monster that just keeps on chugging along. But also at the same time, the rising tide floats all boats. Azure and Google Cloud kind of being legitimate contenders as well. That for me, in hindsight, it's like, well, yeah, of course. And we kind of always were hoping and thinking that would happen, but just the level of it has been amazing to me.
Yeah, I think, like the one stat that always kind of jumps out at me, I mean, we could look at all sorts of numbers, but, the fact that those kind of companies, the AWS, Azure, Google, are spending over $1 billion a quarter on sort of data center infrastructure, and granted, some of that goes for people like Google, goes into search and other things. But I mean, that's a massive, massive investment, and it sort of lends itself towards where we'll see the big consolidation of computing go in the future. So yeah, I think that surprised us a lot.
We need to have Simon back on the show. So for those of you, it's been a while since we had Simon Wardley on the show, but we've been a huge fan, and he called it way back when of the idea here of unless you have billions, you are not going to be able to participate in this. And here we are, however many years later, and that is exactly true. And I remember a number of years ago when all the big companies like IBM and Cisco and a bunch of others, we're going to invest $1 billion in building a cloud.
Yeah, that used to be the big headline.
Right. And Simon used to kind of go, yeah, that's not even going to get you started. And everyone would kind of laugh, but it's true. Yeah, it's exactly true.
It very much came to that. I think, another big thing that sort of gotten me over the last 5 or 6 years is, there used to be, when we first got started back, when we sort of were following a lot of people, but didn't really know anybody, there was kind of this little crowd of people called the Clouderati. You had people like Chris Hoff, you had Simon from who's now at Bromium. You had Sam Johnston. You had a bunch of people. A lot of those folks have gone on to do very, very interesting things. Some of them have become CTOs and CISOs at places. Others have started companies. Christian Riley, who was our very first guest, is now the CTO at Citrix. I'll throw this out to people. If you ever go back and you want to listen to a really informative show, and I go back and listen to our first show from time to time just to kind of see how bad it was. But if you go back, from a production, we had no clue what we were doing. But if you go back and listen to Christian on the very first show, he was part of an organization. He was at a company called Bechtel, which, is huge in construction, right? Not a digital company at the time. And they were doing things like moving their computing assets into colos that were as close to the internet, NAPs at the time. They were not only virtualizing things, which was kind of a thing, but highly automating things, trying to build service layers onto stuff. I mean, this was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And, just to sort of see the vision of what their CTO wanted to do at the time, their CIO wanted to do at the time was pretty amazing. And I think if you go back and listen to that show, you could probably say that's where a lot of companies are today in terms of them saying, well, I want to do digital transformation. So it gives a little bit of a sense of like, as much as we think this stuff is going ridiculously fast, it's still taking people many, many years to get to something, and you have to have the vision to get there.
Yeah, and so many of the folks that we tend to kind of run in circles at all these shows, and everyone's kind of talking is, everyone goes, oh yeah, and innovation's just getting faster, and the curves are just getting faster, but at the same time, then you step back and you do kind of go, okay, a lot of people are just where the innovators were 6 years ago, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that says a lot. And also, too, I think part of the Clouderati kind of moving on is because they kind of did their thing. They understood it. And then they kind of just were like, all right, I'm going to go off and do the next thing. And they were just that far ahead that they've already ridden that wave and gone on to the next thing. And other people are just kind of starting to pop their head up and figure out.
I think for me, the one thing we could say we probably got, I don't want to say, well, yeah, maybe we did get it sort of completely wrong, or at least partially wrong. I think, we got swept up in the OpenStack concept. And I, the more I go back and think about the OpenStack stuff, I think there was a part of it that was interesting because it was software infrastructure, which was very different than kind of hardware-centric infrastructure at the time. I mean, for those of you that have been listening to the show for a long, long time, we originally called the show Two Guys, One Wire because we were interested in converged infrastructure, which way back in the time was sort of this blending of a lot of hardware elements. So it was software infrastructure. It was open source, which I think kind of rattled a lot of people's cage because it was, we're going to be free VMware or cheaper VMware, which, the VMware world was sort of where we got started. And then it introduced this idea of foundations, and we'll talk more about foundations. But I think that was one that was sort of an inflection point, I think, for the show in terms of us figuring out where we were going to focus on, and then I think it was a big inflection point for how the industry changed.
Yeah, and not just that too, but just think of it as infrastructure as a service in general. A lot of the early shows were very much more CloudStack, OpenStack, and Eucalyptus. Remember them?
Yeah.
And it was really interesting too because you had some really interesting trade-offs, and a lot of people just wanting to know trade-offs and okay, this one's open source, this one isn't, this one really works, but maybe only has one or two vendors behind it. This one is much more complex, but is much more open and has a lot of different vendors. And it was really interesting for me from an education standpoint to watch that first wave in the industry kind of peak and then diminish over time and then get replaced with some of these other things. And, at this point we've ridden, all depending on how many you count or how big you count on, maybe 3, 4, 5 different waves over the life of this podcast. And I do feel like, you actually did the analyst job as your day job for a while, but we get to do, the armchair quarterback analysis of a lot of these. And we'll sit around and have beer on the weekends and kind of talk about a lot of this and where things are going. And I feel like over time we've been able to hit them pretty good.
Yeah.
We've gotten better at the prediction game.
Yeah, I think we've been reasonably good. And I think, to a certain extent, we've always tried to stay, I don't know, maybe a couple of years, 18 months ahead of where some of this stuff is, partially because we're curious and so forth. So let me ask this sort of last piece around this to you, and we'll get into sort of where investments are going. But I mean, do you see anything sort of slowing down? Do you see sort of a peaking of some of these tech curves and things starting to normalize a little bit? Or do you see sort of an end game emerging for people that might last for the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I actually do. I think the end game is going to be this mixed mode model, if you will, of certainly a lot of the public cloud increasing, and then certainly a lot of the on-prem, whether it's Kubernetes or some of these others. But I do think everyone's going to settle into the right infrastructure for the right use case, because I think for too often everyone was like, oh, this is the one that's going to solve everything. I can put all of my infrastructure in this configuration and it'll run everything. And everyone's kind of realizing, hey, that's kind of a mess. Like if you do that, that's kind of a mess. You can't solve all of those problems a lot of times. And this more specialized, breaking out of the infrastructure, that isn't, but I don't think it's even 1 or 2. I think it's like, 5 or 6 different models or different kinds of architecture in a enterprise's plan. Going forward.
Yeah. So one of the things we track is kind of this idea of following the money. Where VCs are investing money. We sort of specifically have tracked it around guests who have been on the show. I think it helps us get a sense of, maybe where trends are going, where things might be hype versus reality. What are you seeing in that space in terms of money flows and investment levels and stuff?
Yeah, the biggest thing, and I think this is pretty obvious, is VC investments in infrastructure. It's just becoming more and more rare. I think that again is that a little bit of that wave kind of go in its natural course. A lot of the markets have moved on. They are investing into other areas and investing higher in the stack. I think a lot of the lower level problems in the stack are just getting solved at this point.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. We keep this one spreadsheet that sort of tracks again investments around people that we've talked to and so forth. And what I used to do was if you had shown up on the show and you'd gotten investment, like VC investment after being on the show, I would sort of mark that in green and leave the other ones, leave them blank. And it used to be that almost every line or every other line item for a long time in that spreadsheet was green. People were getting investments. We were seeing incremental investments. And over the last basically 18 months, those green lines have become very few and far between. I think we're seeing, like you said, less investment, less kind of follow-on investment. So it's tough for people to get out of those early rounds. I am still sort of surprised sometimes when I see companies make big investments in hardware-centric companies. Even if they're these hyper-converged companies, that still sort of surprises me. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think, and we've talked to some of the VCs about this, the reluctance to invest in sort of infrastructure software, if you will, because of the predominance of what happens in the public cloud, or that capability could just become a service in the public cloud. I think that's definitely on the minds of VCs these days, both in tools and infrastructure and so stuff like that.
Yeah, and I would also add too. So the two big trends I think that we kind of rode when it comes to VC related stuff is infrastructure and open source companies, and yeah, coming from a hardware centric startup that did get a good exit. I will say this, looking back. It is mind-bogglingly complex when it comes to doing a hardware startup, and I can't speak as much to the open source startup side of the house, but it definitely seems like you have different set of challenges. A hardware infrastructure startup definitely has a lot of upfront costs and its supply chain and all these other things. And I feel like an open source startup has the exact opposite problem. It's probably a lot easier to get stuff out there, but then it's harder to monetize. So you almost have two sides of a coin that we've been following, each with their own unique set of challenges, without a doubt. But at the same time, it does seem like maybe you could comment more on the open source VC side of things from the spreadsheet, but it almost seems like money's kind of drying up everywhere.
Yeah, and I think we're going to jump into the open source VC stuff here in a second. I think we've said a few times in the show. I think VMware is very possibly the last sort of proprietary software, enterprise software company that we'll see get as big as they did. I think the VirtuStream may be the last $billion service provider that we see get acquired in that space. I mean, we've seen Rackspace struggle with some. We've seen, we saw VirtuStream get acquired as a service provider, but they almost were like more of an overlay than being a cloud or service provider. And SolidFire obviously had a big exit, but I think we'll see that decline too in terms of like not SolidFire, but sort of the hardware acquisition space. I think those may go down as sort of kind of benchmark kind of companies in this era in terms of, will we see something like that again? And I don't know that we will. I think, we'll see. But let's talk a little bit about sort of the open source space. Both of us now over the last 6 years have had a chance to be involved with open source, not just kind of an observer, but directly. You were involved with, when you were at Citrix with what was, Cloudstack, the cloud.com stuff, it got acquired, it became Cloudstack. There was a whole open source space around that. I was involved with OpenStack with Lou Tucker at Cisco and did some open source stuff at EMC. And now it's my day job at Red Hat. What have you seen happen in open source over the last 5 or 6 years? Well,
so it's been really interesting. And this is something I kind of learned over time. It seems like both I can actually approach it from two different ways, from the Cloudstack days as well as from SolidFire days, integrating with either Cloudstack or OpenStack. So I'll come at that answer two ways. You always had kind of two kinds of customers in there. You had the big customers who were super interested in it, super invested in it, had very large architecture and development staffs, and they were actively, writing for it. They were maybe serving on the boards. They were, serving as project leads and really, really invested in the product itself, no matter what it was. But at the same time, there's a lot of overhead there. There's a lot of expertise there, and there's been some kind of horror stories in the industry. More specifically, probably in the OpenStack space, I can name a bunch of them where entire groups kind of overnight left one customer and went to another. And so it was really interesting to see those big customers and their reasons and motives for being involved in open source. And then you had the smaller customers who they just want stuff to work.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily want to hire a bunch of people, and they don't necessarily maybe want to, do code commits back and some of these other things. And so you had these two interesting camps develop over time. And it was interesting to see which one are you serving, right? Is it the greater good of open source, or is it the, just get shit done model? Sometimes it was both. But I'll be honest, I felt like more and more it was one or the other at times, right? And it's been really, really interesting to see just open source ecosystems and how they operate over time, and also how they shift over time. I would say, from the ones I've been involved in, what they believe and how they operate 1 year is maybe not necessarily the same they would 2 or 3 years from now.
Right.
So, and then of course, there's the monetization aspects of all of it, and is monetization good or is it bad?
Right.
Which is a whole other topic. How about you?
Yeah, no, you're right. So I think I've seen a few different things. I think, from the perspective of being, involved with a couple of different vendors who are doing it, I think it is one of these things where it's very hard for companies who don't sort of have open sources as part of their go-to-market. It's difficult to sort of get involved in those communities, right? I think there's sometimes this belief that, like, well, if we put some stuff on GitHub, sort of build it and they will come. It is very hard to sort of introduce open source into your portfolio if it's not part of your DNA. Your sales reps don't understand the concept of stuff that's, at its core given away for free, or they don't understand the concept of trying to sell against something that's, exactly the same as what's available for free. Like that was I think a difficult thing. And so we've seen some companies who have tried to be in open source after being proprietary companies who, have some struggles with it. They struggle with everything from, their legal departments allowing them to put stuff on GitHub to, what's the business model? How do you incent your field people to deal with it? How do you mix that in the portfolio? So that's been one part of it, I think, has been interesting. I've been very surprised at how many companies, like end user customers, are now making, open source, especially this sort of leading edge open source stuff like containers and Kubernetes and other things, just kind of part of their everyday, like that's the technology they're going to use. And we see that become the thing that they compare other stuff to. So I've been very interested and surprised over the last, say, 12 to 18 months at how regularly that happens at very large companies, not just, I think early on when we talked to people, you'd go, well, who are the types of companies that you work with? And they would go, well, it's the mid-tier university out of the Philippines is doing this side project. And then, some other, and now it's like, the banks, the insurance companies, the automotive companies, across the world, are making that pretty viable. The other thing that's been interesting in the open source space is to watch, there's this new focus on user experience, user interface. And I think a lot of that's driven because of the iPhone and how simple it is to, the iPhone and Android, how simple it is around apps. It's interesting to see this resurgence in open source around people kind of building sort of an open core model, but the open core piece isn't really like unique features. It tends to be more sort of like, hey, we're going to make our proprietary stuff around the user interface and the experience and stuff. So we've seen, sort of Docker trying to do stuff like that. Pivotal's trying to do some things like that. Cloudera's been trying to do some of that. So it'll be interesting to see if that approach becomes a viable monetization model. And there's different. Our friend Joseph Jacks, JJ, who was was early in the Kubernetes days, is starting to track that stuff, and we've got some stuff in the show notes around that.
So let's kind of move on to the next thing then. Something else I think we've seen as a trend over the years was this kind of divide between those on the cloud bandwagon and those that aren't. And this one's been more subtle and probably a little bit harder to find because the revenue doesn't exactly track this, but what's your thoughts on this a little bit more? Where do you kind of see the next couple of years of the industry going, and where do you think this is all going to play out in the end?
Yeah. So, I think it was interesting when we were first starting the show, like we said, Amazon was just starting to kind of, get up some momentum, but they were still less than $1 billion a year company. And so, a lot of the people that we knew, the communities that we knew, were still very tied to things that were sold on-prem, delivered and operated on-prem and so forth. And there, we used to joke like the easiest way to sell against the public cloud was to basically say, well, it's probably going to fail. It's only been a couple of months, so it should go down here pretty soon for a weekend. And oh, by the way, you're going to lose your job. And so it was, we used to joke that was probably the easiest sales pitch you could make to anybody about why you should keep stuff on-prem. It was very interesting this last couple of weeks. We had a chance to go to, say, like the serverless conference, and then I was at the Interop event out in Las Vegas, which is still very kind of infrastructure centric. And obviously serverless was, the world's going all serverless and everything will be out of, serverless service out of the public cloud. And then a couple of weeks later, I was at the Interop show, and there were people literally just raising their hands when we would talk about topics, and they would go, yeah, that technology is all well and good. Like, am I going to have a job in 5 years? And I think the contrast between those two things is really kind of startling to me. In terms of like, there's a certain amount of it that makes me think, when I look at something, say like the U.S. election, where you had this big thing between, what they'd call like the coastal elites and the people in the Midwest who were struggling because the factory jobs had kind of gone away. And like, it feels like the gap between the people who have jumped on the bandwagon and those who didn't is growing very quickly. Yeah.
And along those lines too, what's super interesting there, kind of an unrelated fact, but also kind of you can use the analogy forward. At the turn of the last century, so in 1900, like I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was like 90% of the occupations in the United States was farming.
Yep.
And then at the end of the century, so going into 2000. It was the exact flip. It was like less than 5% is left as farmers in the United States or something like that. I don't remember the exact figures. Right. But the idea was at the beginning of the century, everyone was farming and no one could envision or picture anyone doing anything other than that. And then at the turn of the century, people were doing jobs that weren't even invented yet and weren't even created yet.
Right.
And everything kind of went to commodity, if you will, over time, right? And we are probably at that point in the industry where the reason why there is this level of confusion is because maybe the next set of jobs haven't been invented yet.
Yeah, no, I think there's a real reality that I forwarded a tweet that I saw this morning that was like, here's 10 jobs that have been invented in the last 7 years, right? And that, or maybe it was the last 10 years. Anyways, it was basically aligned to when the iPhone came out. And if you think about it, I think it was 2007, both the iPhone came out and Amazon Web Services had their first like 2 or 3 services that were out. So if you think about the impact that those two things have had on all sorts of stuff. So it was like, well, there was never Uber drivers, there was never cloud engineers, there was never social media people. There was never, stuff like, I think YouTube came out around that same year too. There was never people who were, putting their entire career on YouTube as, say, like a musician or an entertainer or something. I think you're right. A lot of these jobs don't exist yet, but they will become some sort of byproduct of this sort of digitization of business, right? We talk about it. Everybody's a software company.
Exactly. And I still firmly believe that, the next big vendors in the industry are still developing. But I think we're going to, just the same way we had IBM, Cisco, HP, Dell, we very hardware centric companies. There will be a point in time where the biggest tech companies in the industry, from an infrastructure standpoint, will be the likes of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, et cetera. And of course, and let's not forget, just because we tend to talk about the public cloud on this show, the SaaS-based offerings, right? Yeah. I mean, you look at Salesforce, you look at some of these other things. If a company is going to start a new company and doing tech, I mean, they're insane these days to really install traditional infrastructure, right? It's get everything through SaaS or get everything through public cloud.
Well, and I think the other thing that's worth watching is, not just the company that might be out in front or something, like an Amazon or whatever. It's, can the ecosystem around it make money? Right. So we used to, like Diane Green, when she was at VMware, used to have this famous quote where she would say, because people were afraid of virtualization. It was gonna get rid of jobs. It was gonna replace hardware. And she would say, look, here's the deal. For every dollar that VMware makes, there's $10 to $15 that the ecosystem's going to make because of the change that it makes to things, and whether that's in hardware or in services or other types of software. And so I think it's important when people are trying to figure out like where's the trends going, is to not just say, oh, well, something's hot, like a containers or something like that. It's can the strong players in that place drive revenue for the whole ecosystem? Like because that's the ecosystem allows something to get broad and scale. The sort of the community of people who help sell it and service it and customize it. They have to be able to be successful in these things. And I think if you look at the big trends, whether it's around mobile, we've seen certain ecosystems evolve. We've seen the Salesforce ecosystem is massive. That's another big thing to go watch is can you make your partners money, or are you the only one who makes any money in that? And that's a hard thing for it to scale if that's the case.
And we keep saying it over and over, just, follow the money. That's one of the biggest secrets. Well, not really a secret, but that's been one of the biggest themes of our show has been we tend to connect the dots by following the money. Yeah.
Yeah, because the reality is there will always be some cool new technology that's coming next, and it might be the exact same thing as something else. So, hey, so you and I talk all the time because we're always trying to figure out do we not do we keep doing the show, but what do we focus the show on? Obviously, we've spent a little bit of time lately focusing on serverless because it feels like a little bit of a paradigm shift in terms of, what is the platform? How do applications get built? What are some of the other things? Give listeners a sense of what are some of the other things we've been kind of kicking around that are not only interesting to us, but we may, focus the show on a little bit more than maybe we have in the past.
Yeah. It's really interesting because for us, again, it's sad when we're like, okay, serverless. Okay, we've been there, done that now. But what we're really looking forward to is, again, trying to really stay out in front and really trying to figure out, where everyone is going next, and probably going to be not shifting the show certainly, but what we've been talking about is kind of doing, almost like clusters of shows, if you will, of a series, and certainly something around AI. AI is getting a lot of attention, without a doubt, in the industry right now, and more of like business centric, both SaaS and public cloud kind of things. And then as well as I feel like now that everyone's starting to settle into, I'm going to finally use the term multi-cloud, right? Because I felt like there was a lot of times everyone's like, oh, multi-cloud, but no one ever did it.
Yeah.
But I think everyone is now starting to understand, okay, Azure has these strengths, on-prem has this strength with this app I'm running, AWS has this strength, and everyone is actually starting to embrace not just, hey, I'm going to go here and then I'm going to shift to there, but actually running different workloads in different places. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
From an operations perspective, from an architecture perspective. So we definitely have some upcoming topics and some guests potentially slated around things like that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're not abandoning the cloud. I think it becomes the foundation of what we're doing, but I think we do want to, keep the show relevant, keep it moving forward and sort of looking at, what are the things that are kind of, now that you've got certain amounts of stability in the base, what do those new business models look like? And so, that's, I think, why we're going to have, kind of an increased focus, not a new focus, but sort of an increased focus on, what does this mean for people's business? What is some of this digitization, digital transformation sort of mean, and try and put it in a way that's hopefully helpful for you guys to understand. So. Well, listen, let's sort of wrap up. Again, thank you again to everybody who listens every week, and it's pretty amazing. I know you and I were out at the serverless conf, whenever it was, a couple of weeks ago, and we literally had people who we it was a small show, and we had people who come up to us and they would say, it's been weird. You guys were standing behind me for the last 4 or 5 minutes, and I heard you talking, and I know your voice. Like I've had your voice in my head for the last couple of years, and it's like those are the kind of things that are crazy when people tell us they listen to the show. So thank you to everybody who listens. Let me ask you one last one last question to wrap this up. Let's talk about something boring, right? We always talk about leading edge and what's going on. There's a little bit of a new trend that people are saying, hey, go make some of this stuff boring, make the infrastructure boring. There was people calling out, containers when there was some of the hashing back and forth between Rocket and Core OS and different foundations, and make that boring. I mean, do you think we'll ever see in our kind of cutthroat industry people striving to make stuff boring, or are there going to be areas that become boring?
Well, so again, I'm going to go back to Simon Woodley once again, and just you have a struggle here in that when you hit mass adoption, you also hit commodity.
Yep.
And how do you, whether it's differentiate yourself, maybe it's price, whether it's features, how do you stick out in a commodity world? And that isn't a challenge even necessarily of, infrastructure is boring kind of mentality, right? That is just the state of a very mature market. That doesn't, because we say it's commodity, some people kind of say, well, that's negative connotation, and maybe there's not money to be made there. There's money to be made. There's money to be made at scale. But how do you walk that very fine line between mass adoption and commoditization and differentiation all at the same time? And I don't have a good answer there. I will say I'm looking forward to it, because it certainly means that it is, everyone wants this to be mass adopted. Okay, great. It's mass adopted. Oh, no. Now it's boring. Huh. It's like you can't have it both ways. Which one do you want, right? And I'm really, really happy about it, and we'll certainly continue to follow everything and certainly keep doing shows on it as well.
Yeah, I think so. We'll have to go back and look at a little bit of stuff and see if we can put some numbers to this and so forth. But even just if we think about the life cycle of this show, so we keep saying 6 or 7 years. When we first got started, virtualization was kind of a big deal. Like server virtualization was a big deal. It was changing a lot. People were reshaping how they did operations. It was driving the SDN sort of push around networking. And here we are, 6, 7 years later, and nobody talks about what's new in virtualization, right? So you had an industry reshaping thing that's become boring. I think we think about the iPhone. It was revolutionary at the time, and nowadays, Apple does a thing, and we all go, okay, it's newer, it's faster, it's thinner, it's whatever, and maybe we'd like the glass to not break so much, or we'd like it to be waterproof, but the smartphone has essentially become boring. So, I think we go through these cycles of, maybe it's 7 years, maybe it's 10 years. I think it's going to depend a little bit about stuff, but things do eventually become boring. And we move on to, the next thing. We don't abandon the old thing, but I think we're going to start to see where you can kind of map a little bit of, how fast will a cycle or a hype, go from, hype to, operational to sort of boring. And I think it's a good thing. I mean, people don't freak out about some of those things like they used to anymore. But you do see, like you said, the sort of mass adoption has to happen. Consolidation happens in the industry around who wins and loses, and we all sort of move on. And it's like we've always said, you better be good at learning. You better be good at being curious, because we're not going to have 20-year cycles anymore where the industry just sort of you can do one job for 15 or 20 years, or one segment of an industry.
Yep.
So listen, man, we've been rambling for a while. We've been going on episode 300. Any last thoughts, or you want to wrap it up and take us home?
Well, I mean, just the biggest thought I'd say is just thank you. I just have to echo the sentiment of, when we started all of this, I don't know that I ever thought we could measure the amount of episodes in hundreds and the amount of listeners in millions. That was certainly never kind of this, but we're certainly happy it turned into that. And we're really happy people have decided to kind of share the journey with us and have really been able to dig into the learning and sharing aspects of all of this. So we certainly thank you for that. And with that, we're just going to kind of wrap it up here, and we'll talk to everyone next week. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.